Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Worldview with Trudy Rubin. My name is Luis Carrasco. I'm the Deputy Opinion Editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer and your host for today's discussion. Over the next hour, Trudy and I will address your questions on the situation in Ukraine and the Hamas-Israel war. Trudy Rubin has decades of experience reporting on the Middle East, Russia, and Eastern Europe. She has been on the ground at all of these places and has spoken with many of the players involved over the years. So we are truly lucky to have her expertise on this. Trudy, welcome.
Good to be here.
Excellent. So before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. We have several questions pre-submitted by readers, but if you're watching us on inquirer.com/live, just hit the ask a question button to submit a question. If you're watching on social media, hop on over to inquirer.com/live to ask your questions. So thank you. Now, Trudy, let's get right to it. We have limited time, so we will try to split the discussion half Ukraine and then half Israel and Gaza, if that works for you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with the money. We have a question. Given the current leadership in the House of Representatives, what will happen if Ukraine and Israel are not supported?
Uh, Before getting to that, let me just say that this is a different format from what we usually do when a guest is speaking, or sometimes I'm giving a presentation, because both issues are so important for American foreign policy. And tomorrow is the second anniversary of the current war in Ukraine. You remember that Putin first invaded in 2014 and took Crimea and part of the East, and then invaded again on February 24th, 2022. The last time I was in Ukraine, I've been there 3 times since February 2022, last time in July and over until August. And I have a longstanding interest in Russia and Ukraine. I was also there in 2014 in Ukraine, just after the first Russian invasion. If Ukraine is not supported by the United States, I feel this will be remembered as one of the greatest self-inflicted foreign policy debacles that the U.S. has ever perpetrated, shooting itself not only in the foot, but in the knee and in the gut. Let me just talk about the immediate consequences. Right now, Ukrainian troops on the troops are on the front lines without bullets. The reason the town of Avdiivka just fell is because U.S. Ammunition supplies have been tapering off for months because Congress refused to take up the supplemental with Ukraine aid, which was introduced first months ago. And that means Ukrainians are dying because Congress will not put up these funds. And President Zelensky himself has said that Ukraine could lose this war. The Russians are putting on a full court press, sending in convicts, ethnic minorities as cannon fodder to throw them at Ukraine, along with Iranian supplied long range missiles and drones and missiles from North Korea. So this could really result in a territorial pushback, and Putin will not stop because he sniffs the possibility of victory because of U.S. weakness.
You mentioned the T word, not troops, but Trump. How does continued fealty by the GOP to Trump play into that current denial of military support?
It plays in front and center. There is no question that there is a majority in the House of Representatives that supports Ukraine aid. However, Trump has pressured that majority and the Speaker the House, Mike Johnson, not to move forward with Ukraine aid. Now, you'll recall that the Senate, bending to Republican demands, put together a very tough package on aid to the border and preventing migrants from overcoming the border. That package was never even given a chance because Trump said he didn't want it after Republicans had insisted there could only be aid for Ukraine and Israel if it was attached to the border package. And now the Senate finally voted that package up without the border piece. And it is now on the House side, and Speaker Mike Johnson is refusing to put it to a vote. The reason that a majority can't vote for it is the Speaker's blockage. Also, any Republicans who try to go around the Speaker and bring the package up are bound to be primaried. That means that a MAGA opposition candidate will be inserted against them because they crossed Trump in their primary election. Their families may be threatened. They may be threatened. So Trump opposition to aid for Ukraine is the key to why this package, including aid for Israel and Taiwan, at the moment is in limbo.
So if Western aid to Ukraine dries up, do you think Russia will eventually overrun the entire country? Will they stop at a certain point? What if they don't have those resources? What's Ukraine's future look like?
There's a common misconception that Putin wants to occupy all of Ukraine. No, he wants to destroy Ukraine. He wants to make it impossible for Ukraine to function as an independent, sovereign country, to break it physically and economically, and to remove the current government and insert a pro-Putin puppet government. If the aid is curtailed and Putin can move forward unobstructed by a Ukraine army desperate for artillery ammunition and bullets for their guns, what Putin will try to do, what he is already trying to do, is mass as many troops in the east as he can and take back as much territory as he can. He's pushing to do this before fake elections in March, when he will be chosen for his fifth term as president with no opposition. And this means immense Ukrainian casualties because Ukrainians will keep on fighting, but with very little to hold the Russians back on the ground. Now, we can get into the question of whether it's possible to negotiate with Putin. I'm sure that's going to come up in questions. But what Putin will try to do is create a frozen conflict where Ukraine is bleeding, where the country can't be rebuilt economically because the war goes on, and where he can rebuild Russian manpower and weapons supplies and then start the fight again. So his aim, as I said, is to break the country and ultimately create a situation whereby political maneuvering, he can get rid of Zelensky and control Ukraine through a puppet regime, as he does in Belarus through dictator Lukashenko.
So what can the administration do if Congress delays Ukraine aid?
This is indeed the question. If the United States looked at Ukraine as if we were in World War II and they were looking at saving Britain, when the Nazis had taken over Europe and was trying to destroy Britain with attacks from the air. And you will remember at that time, we had an America First Congress, which did not want to send aid to Britain. America First, does that sound like a familiar label? In order to get around that isolationist Congress, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, did all kinds of manipulations to get desperately needed aid to Britain. Ukraine has to be treated as if it is Britain during World War II because Putin is indeed a Hitler. The analogy isn't perfect. He is not going to roll across Europe with troops. Russia isn't strong enough. But if the administration caves under Trump pressure and Congress cannot do a workaround, then Putin will try by all kinds of means to undermine democracy in Europe. He will nibble at Baltic countries, at former Eastern Europe satellites, because he wants to reconstitute a Russian empire like the Soviet Empire. He will put nuclear weapons in space, as you've recently been reading about. He will do all kinds of asymmetric warfare in the Arctic, in the Baltic Sea, in the North Sea, with cables underground. There are all kinds of means, electronic and physical, that Putin can do to undermine Europe and our allies and NATO. And if Trump is elected and downgrades the U.S. role in NATO, then Putin will only have his dreams handed to him on a plate. But what can the administration do? Let me run through a few things that must be done if aid is cut off under pressure from Trump. First of all, there are efforts in Congress to do a workaround Speaker Mike Johnson. There are certain kinds of parliamentary maneuvers. For example, a bill can be brought to the floor without Johnson's approval if a majority in Congress sign a petition requesting that it be done. If all 213 Democrats sign, there will only be a need for 4 Republicans to sign on to get the supplemental bill for aid to Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and some border aid to the floor. Are there 4 honest, decent, stalwart Ronald Reagan members of the House of Congress who would vote for this? We will see shortly, because this may be the only way to get the bill to the floor. But what the White House has to do is implore all Democrats to hold firm in getting the bill to the floor. If some want amendments on the Israel part of the bill, that can come up before a final vote, in which a majority in Congress would still be needed. But every House legislator I have spoken with believes that if the bill would come to the floor, you'd have a majority because more Republicans would be willing to vote for it, because there is still a solid block of Republicans in the House who believe that defeat in Ukraine would set American policy back, would embolden Putin, China, North Korea, and Iran, all of whom are allies of Putin, and would ultimately result in a higher cost to the United States, because we would wind up sooner or later paying the cost in manpower and money for an aggressive Putin. So get the bill to the floor. Then Biden must find financial workarounds. As I said, it can be done. Where there's a will, there's a way. And most importantly, Biden must free up critical weapon systems that he has been holding back that could make a difference for Ukraine. While Ukraine is slightly being pushed back on the ground because of lack of ammunition, it is making great gains on the sea. Ukraine doesn't have a navy, and yet it has pushed back the Russian fleet using long-range missiles, and that fleet shoots missiles at Ukraine. It has targeted bases in Crimea, Russian bases, which also shoot missiles at Ukraine. If Biden would finally give a green light to long-range ATACMS missiles, that the U.S. has 1,100 in stocks, and Lockheed Martin exports 500 a year, there is no reason not to supply these long-range missiles, which Ukraine has been begging for over a year. That would help Ukraine keep Russia on the back foot in Crimea and in the sea. It would keep morale up, and it would buy time in hopes that Congress might eventually be turned around. And also F-16s, which we have delayed. Send them now. Keep the morale up in Ukraine.
Let me ask you a question, a live question we have right now. You mentioned that Putin will not stop. The question is, for those that are against further Ukraine aid, do they not realize a huge savings based on our current policy, rather one that involves U.S. NATO troops?
It's not only that people don't recognize the savings, there's a lot of misconception about where the money goes that we send. And a lot of misconception about what Europe gives in comparison to the United States. Recently at a town hall, I saw Donald Trump claiming that Europe only gave $35 billion. It's totally made up figure. The Europeans have approved more than twice the amount of aid that the United States gives. And we can get into the question of how much they support NATO later. But it also is far from what Trump and MAGA Republicans claim. But the Europeans don't have the military supplies that we do, which brings us to the second question of where the money goes. Many Americans are fooled into believing that we send pots of money over to Ukraine. No, 60% of the money for military aid to Ukraine stays right in the United States. And the bulk of that pays for weapons that are in Pentagon stocks. Some of them old, not all of them, but what the money goes for is to pay for upgraded versions of the weapons that we are sending. For example, ATACMS are about to be replaced by something called PRISMs. So it's not even state of the art. F-16s are going to be replaced by F-35s. So basically, the money, the bulk of it is going for production and jobs in the United States, building up our arsenals with new weapons, while Ukraine gets weapons they desperately need, but aren't the newest. So financially, it is absolutely false to say that we are just throwing money at Ukraine. And as far as long range, there is no question that if we encourage Putin to think that he can do whatever he wants, he can kill Navalny, he can keep the body of this famous dissident from Navalny's mother unless she agrees to a secret funeral. He can assassinate opponents of Russia in European countries. There was just another one killed, shot 10 times or more in Spain last week. Next thing, Russia will be assassinating, Putin will be assassinating Russian dissidents in the US. And he can put nuclear weapons in space. We will ultimately be paying for enabling this messianic, not madman, but delusional dictator to think that the US is so weak and so unwilling to challenge him that he can do whatever he wants. And we will pay for it. Right now, Putin is waiting for Donald Trump to be reelected because he thinks that Trump will hand Ukraine over on a platter to him. But in the meantime, if there's no aid now, we will be paying for it in disrespect by the world, in loss of global leadership, in distrust of American promises, and ultimately in manpower and money.
Let me ask you, beyond Trump, beyond the holdup on the aid, why the holdup from Biden, right? Why not give Ukraine what it needs? This has been, a topic of many of your columns. Why are they dragging their feet? Why? And I feel like there is no satisfactory answer.
I feel the same way. Only yesterday, I asked John Kirby, the spokesman on strategic issues for the National Security Council in the White House, the same question. What are we waiting for with the ATACMS? And he just gave me the same old. We don't have enough in stocks. We need the money. Well, okay, but before Congress blocked the money, why weren't we sending ATACMS? Because Ukraine has been asking for them for months and months and months. I think that at one point, President Biden was genuinely concerned that firing these long-range missiles at bases in Crimea and Russian ships might lead to an escalation by Putin and finally the use of tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. I believe the White House has long since concluded that this is a bluff. After all, Britain and France sent long-range missiles to Ukraine, not as powerful or as long-range as the ATACMS, but Ukraine has used them, and sadly has almost used them up, in targeting Russian ships and Russian bases in Crimea. And Putin has not used tactical nuclear weapons because it is not to his advantage. This is not the kind of a war that a tactical nuke could affect. Tactical nukes were meant to hit large agglomerations of enemy troops and break through the lines. That's not the kind of war that's being fought in Ukraine, and Putin would become a pariah. Even China and India have warned him not to use those weapons. So if it's not nuclear, what is it? Then there's the claim that the US doesn't want those weapons to be fired into Russia. But Ukraine has promised from the beginning that weapons provided by the US would not be fired on Russian soil. In actual fact, it's ridiculous that they can't fire at Russian bases that are sending missiles into the center of their cities and killing civilians. But they have given their word and they haven't broken their word. So again, that is a false excuse. The idea that we don't have enough in stock, as I said, we have 1,100 of them sitting in storage, and we are not going to be using them anytime soon. So it would not degrade our security. Furthermore, as I said, Lockheed Martin has an active production line, which they could be asked to speed up. And they are exporting those missiles to countries like Morocco when Ukrainians are dying because we won't send them those missiles. So it is a mystery to me. There are rumors again that the White House is considering sending them, but then what are they waiting for? This would be the best response to Navalny's death and to Putin's belief that the US is now finished and he can just roll over Ukrainian troops in the east and feel safe in Crimea.
Well, before we switch gears to talk about Israel and Hamas, how do you envision peace, the end of the war in Ukraine?
It is very hard to envision peace unless the United States joins Europe, which now gets it much more than US officials, certainly Trump, and unfortunately Biden, even though he has given so much support, get it. There will not be peace talks. Why? Because Putin has made it very clear he has no interest in talks. He has said bluntly, Russia has annexed all the territory that it has seized, even some territory it hasn't yet seized, and considers them now part of Russia, and he will give back no part of Russia. That's number one. He has said clearly that Ukraine must be denazified, which is ludicrous because Ukraine is not led by Nazis. It's led by a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. The president's grandfather fought the Nazis in World War II. So Putin is out for crushing Ukraine and then moving on to tackle other non-NATO members and nibble at NATO members because he does not believe that the US in the future will support NATO members with Article 5, meaning one for all and all for one. So how can there be peace? There can only be peace, A, if Putin is put on the back foot, if it is clear he cannot win, if that becomes clear to the Russian public. And I personally believe that can only happen if Crimea is made untenable for the Russians. If all bridges and sea connections and ship connections and bases are made untenable, and that can only happen with F-16s and long-range missiles, ATACMS, while continuing to support Ukraine in the east. And finally, Putin's word is worth nothing. So even if there were a ceasefire, even if there were a temporary deal, he would not honor it. He has broken every accord that he has signed in the past with Ukraine, including one where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. It had nuclear weapons after the fall of the Soviet Union. It gave them up in 1994 in return for strategic guarantees from the US, the UK, and Russia that its sovereignty would be respected. Ha, ha, ha. So I believe in the end, Ukraine would have to be made part of NATO. That is the only way there could be peace, because that is the only way that Putin would not try again.
Thank you, Trudy. We obviously have a lot to talk about Ukraine, but we only have so much time. So let's shift over to the war in Gaza. We have a question that's fairly blunt right off the top, which is, why is Benjamin Netanyahu still in power?
Good question. Well, according to the Israeli parliamentary system, Netanyahu can only be removed if either new elections are called or if his coalition breaks and he is forced to resign with or without new elections. He has a 4-person majority, 64 out of 120. It is a strange coalition. But to overthrow him internally, 4 members of his own party, or 5, would have to disavow him. And there's a Trump syndrome there. They're afraid to do it because they're afraid they wouldn't be reelected next time. Or one of the parties in his coalition would have to pull out. And he is dependent on far-right parties, 2 extremist messianic parties that right now are getting everything they want in Gaza and the West Bank, so look unlikely to pull out, or religious parties who are also getting everything they want, because even though the war is causing economic problems for Israel, his government is still paying off ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties and exempting them from military service. So right now, the question is how to get him out. It probably will depend on an internal shift. Opposition parties are calling for his resignation, but so far it hasn't worked. I think some people are also afraid of holding elections during wartime, but many in the opposition say, and I think it's true, that unless Netanyahu is thrown out of power by legitimate means, the war in Gaza is heading for disaster.
Does Biden risk losing the election by not standing up to Netanyahu, but by not? It seems like there are already reports that younger voters are being turned off by what's happening. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, this is complicated. I mean, Biden has a lot of problems, we know, in this election. And ultimately, I think it's going to come down to whether people believe it would be better to have Donald Trump again, a man who has publicly pledged to dismantle democracy in this country, who has defamed free elections, tried to undermine them, and no doubt will do so again. If that's the preference to Biden, then the whole country is in terrible trouble. And it's not just about Israel and Gaza. Clearly, there are problems in Michigan where there is a large contingent of Arab American voters. There will be a primary in Michigan next Tuesday, and I think we'll see how that plays out on the Democratic side, if voters stay home or whatever. I feel for those voters. I understand their pain. Many of them, no doubt, have relatives in Gaza and the West Bank. And I'm sure we're going to talk now more about Biden's policy. But, you know, in the end, those voters have to decide on whether voting for Trump or sitting it out is going to help the situation in Gaza. And frankly, since Trump considers himself a close friend of Netanyahu and promoted a peace deal in which there would never be a Palestinian state, I can't see the advantage of helping Trump win.
Opinions on the war obviously are complicated. There's a question from a reader saying that they can be against Trump, they can be against Biden and not be seen as anti-American. But, you know, why can't folks be against Netanyahu's policies and leadership without being labeled anti-Israel or anti-Semitic?
I think it's a very good question. I think these labels are often painfully misplaced, if not ridiculous. According to such labels, half the country of Israel, because the country is divided politically, or at least it was totally divided before this war, before the Gaza war, would be considered anti-Semitic. In fact, 80% of the public wants in Israel wants to remove Netanyahu. Are they anti-Semitic? I think that part of this labeling is due to an unvoiced fear, sometimes voiced, but often subliminal, by Jews in the United States and in Europe, that the return of overt anti-Semitism has now gotten out of control. Now, frankly, the return of overt anti-Semitism in this case, in the United States, I think can be traced to Donald Trump's opening the door to racist, white nationalist commentaries that have run wild, and to groups that revel in this kind of talk on social media. He has associated himself with people like Alex Jones. The White House has invited in, I'll never forget, in an opposition media conference early in his term, a cartoonist who drew cartoons of George Soros with a huge beak nose being run by a puppet labeled Rothschild. I mean, these are the kind of people that have been associated with by Trump's acolytes and Trump himself. He was the one who said there are good people on both sides in Charlottesburg when marches carrying torches and shouting, "Jews will not replace us," were marching by synagogues. So the door was opened wide by Trump, and these flames are still fanned. And yet what's happened since Gaza is that in sympathy with, in righteous anger at the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, groups have taken up the cause of Gaza, who mouth slogans that basically mean the end of the state of Israel. For example, from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, is really code word for one state, from the river to the sea, one Arab Palestinian state. A lot of supporters of that slogan argue that it means equal rights for all. But I happen to believe, and I've spent a lot of time in the region, in fact, my whole career, including 6 years as a foreign correspondent covering Israel and the Arab world, what that means, what it meant for the PLO before they recognized Israel, was one Arab state. Nobody who isn't unfamiliar with the Middle East, Israel, and the Palestinian question can believe that one state is possible. I know there are some who are familiar who say it will happen because it's inevitable. What I say is a one-state reality might happen if Israel doesn't permit the separation from the Palestinians into some kind of demilitarized state. But in a one-state reality, it will be brutal civil war. You can see that starting on the West Bank, where radical settlers are killing and torching Palestinian villages and Palestinian farmers because they've been given the green light by Netanyahu and his government. And the killing will be on both sides. You also see terrorist attacks. The reality bites. And I think that this causes fear in the Jewish community. It also causes terrible pain in the Palestinian community. But the fear here I think, translates into blindness to the broader picture. And the use of anti-Semite as a charge has to be carefully calibrated, because so many of the people who want aid for Gaza, who are looking for a ceasefire, and I have my grave doubts about a permanent ceasefire, but I believe there must be a several-week ceasefire to let aid in and protection for civilians. But you cannot call people who call for a ceasefire anti-Semites. You cannot call people who point out the starvation and medical epidemics on the verge and suffering of Palestinian children in Gaza. You cannot simply defame them by calling people who are against those things anti-Semites.
Do you see Israel changing its strategy, just the intensity of the aggression that it's, tens of thousands of dead civilians so far?
Well, this comes back to Biden policy. Biden has tried everything to make clear that he is a friend of Israel. At one level, that was important, because I think it's necessary for Israelis to understand that Biden is on the side of security for Israel, and he is against terrorist attacks like those by Hamas, because Hamas's charter calls for the destruction of the state of Israel and the killing of all Jews. It is written specifically, and attempts to pretty it up in an updated charter in 2017 or 1817, I think. If you read the whole thing, they don't pretty it up at all. So Biden tried to give, as they call it in Israel, stage directions to make clear that any criticism did not come from wanting to sacrifice Israel. As a result, Biden is incredibly popular among the Israeli public. But Netanyahu, as is his wont, has taken this gift from Biden, swallowed it, and then spat in Biden's eye. And so how you stop things now, I personally, and I have written this, I don't see any way of halting this and moving towards some kind of negotiated solution that includes a political path for the Palestinians. I don't see how you do this until and unless Netanyahu is unseated and new elections bring in a centrist, realistic leader in Israel who will not tolerate the kind of political messianic parties in Netanyahu's coalition who are trying to drive out West Bank Palestinians and trying to take over Gaza and drive the Palestinians out. That's number one. Netanyahu must go. And number two, Hamas must go. The Biden administration has called for the Palestinian Authority to take over in Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is an elected body, but there haven't been elections since 2006. And in those elections, which were held both in Gaza and in the West Bank, Hamas won. Hamas won at the time because the opposition, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and his team did not understand elections. And Fatah ran multiple candidates in each district. So they knocked each other out, helping Hamas to win. And also there was sort of, a lot of people were fed up with Palestinian Authority corruption. So ever since Hamas won, there haven't been new elections because of fear Hamas would win again. Hamas cannot be allowed to run in elections. Hamas opposes the existence of the state of Israel. Right now, the Palestinian Authority is unable to say there should be elections without Hamas because the situation is so dire. 29,000, dead, including militants in Gaza, and active attempts by violent settlers all over the West Bank to push Palestinians out. He doesn't have the courage to say Hamas is a terrorist organization. So with such leadership on the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, I do not see how you head for better times. I think the U.S. is right, Biden is right in principle in what he's calling for, which is a long-term temporary ceasefire during which you can move the refugees in the south of Gaza and in Rafah to guaranteed safe zones, which cannot be bombed by Israel, because Israel has bombed every safe zone. And only then, when massive aid is coming in, and massive aid is being blocked by Israel as much or more than it is so-called blocked by Hamas, only under those conditions can Israel be allowed to mount an offensive against Rafah. Now, you see, Israel is holding back, and I think that is because of U.S. pressure. But the pressure isn't tough enough. And I think ultimately Biden is going to have to tell Netanyahu, I am protecting you from the world's opprobrium, but I can't do it anymore unless you understand that civilians in Gaza must be protected. And meantime, I should add, Netanyahu is guaranteeing that the hostages will be killed. But that's another issue. So do I see any hope? Only when Netanyahu goes and there is global recognition and recognition amongst Palestinians that Hamas cannot be part of the solution.
Have a live question that I'll introduce right now. Basically, we know we spoke about anti-Semitism. What do you say to charges that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza?
Genocide, as we all know, is a loaded word. I don't think that there has been a meeting in Jerusalem like the Wannsee Conference, at which the Nazis discussed how to eradicate Jews from Europe and the world. What Israel is showing towards the Palestinians in Gaza is indifference. It's not calculated destruction. What Israel, now, that doesn't bring back the dead children and women, I grant you. But I don't see it as meeting the title genocide. I see it as potentially meeting the definition of war crimes. Israel has claimed that it provides the way for Palestinians to escape bombing. It simply isn't true. Palestinians were allowed to move south, but they were bombed as they did so. Refugee areas in the south have been bombed. At the same time, I do not think you can ignore the fact that Hamas has readily and willingly, by creating a huge underground infrastructure, which does go under hospitals, headquarters, and so forth, make it inevitable that civilians will be killed because you can't get at those tunnels otherwise. I believe, and I've quoted an Israeli opposition activist whom I respect highly, that Israel should have gone out of its way to protect civilians. But I certainly agree that there has been a lot of not only indifference, but hatred on the Israeli side, because honestly, if you're living in Israel, what happens on October 7th with rapes, with dismemberment, with murder of children is what Israelis watch every day. Videos nonstop. They're not looking at the death of Palestinian children, just as much of the world is looking at the death of Palestinian children and not seeing the Israeli videos. And every Israeli, I can tell you, either knows someone or 2 degrees away from somebody who was murdered, raped, wounded, or has been evacuated from the north or from the south. So I think we can get lost and sent in the wrong direction by debating over the word genocide. I think what we have to focus over is the need belatedly to provide a safe place for Palestinians. And if that is not provided, I think the U.S. should openly and continually oppose a ground assault on Rafah.
Have a question here on why is nobody publicly condemning Arab nations for not aiding Palestinians? And why is there so little blame in public on Hamas really not being there for the people of Gaza?
Well, Hamas can't be. I mean, Hamas is not using the Palestinian people as shields, i.e., you hold one in front of you while you progress with the gun. But Hamas, on the other hand, is in hiding because otherwise they will be killed. So, for example, Israel is accusing UNRWA, the UN aid agency that handles refugees, Palestinian refugees, of being infiltrated by Hamas. And there have been a couple of dozen of people named. But Hamas is the only organization that has the manpower and the logistics inside Gaza to deliver aid. And not every UNRWA worker, and there's thousands of them, is Hamas. But even if some of them are Hamas, the aid needs to be delivered. So what's happening now is Israel is shelling convoys that it claims Hamas is diverting. I don't know if this is true or not true, but I know that aid was getting in at a higher level. But now UNRWA workers are afraid to show up to unload the aid because they're afraid of being shelled. So you have total chaos in inside Gaza in delivery of aid. Israel is also preventing convoys of aid from entering by land, from sea, in ways that are simply unacceptable. The U.S. had grain shipments that it was coordinating with the World Food Program, not UNRWA, that were held up for a month that could have fed 1.5 million people. As for aid by Arab countries, first of all, Arab countries can't get aid in, just like the U.S. can't get aid in because Israel is controlling the influx of aid. Secondly, many Arab countries have helped Palestinians. Jordan has millions of Palestinians living on its soil, and they are entitled almost, not quite entirely, but almost all of them hold Jordanian passports. But Jordan does not want Israel to drive the West Bankers out into Jordan. They cannot handle another flow of refugees. They have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who were driven out during the 1967 war and live in shanty towns, as well as settled Palestinians who were businessmen, professors, etc. So the burden can't be put more heavily on Jordan. Egypt, many Israelis, including the hardline Messianics, want the gates open to Egypt and drive out 1.5 million Palestinians who have fled to the south into Egypt. Egypt is a country whose economy is failing. Egypt is hosting millions of Sudanese refugees who have fled the civil war there, Libyan refugees who have fled the civil war there after we colluded in the overthrow of Gaddafi. Egypt cannot handle 1.5 million refugees, Palestinians, who would flee into the desert. The other side of the Gaza border is the desert, hours and hours away from Cairo. It has no jobs for them. It has no funding for them. And most of all, Egypt is afraid that many of them would be Hamas fighters who are related to the Muslim. The longer this goes on, the harder it is to see. I mean, in the 90s, when I made many trips to Gaza and to the West Bank, I could see the outlines of peace because Palestinian generations then believed that a two-state solution was the best they could hope for. Many of Fatah leaders had been in Israeli prisons. They spoke Hebrew. I interviewed people in Gaza who said Arafat, who had just returned under the Oslo talks, has to get rid of Hamas, which was already in Gaza, but Arafat didn't do it. Now it's so much harder. Gaza will have to be rebuilt. But Netanyahu has no plan for peace, says the Israeli military would be there indefinitely. Under those circumstances, Arab countries are not going to help rebuild Gaza. And under those circumstances, Netanyahu has a fantasy that local Gazan tribal leaders will take over running the municipal boundaries while Israel does the security. And no local leaders are going to do that. If they wouldn't be shot by Hamas remnants, they would be denounced as traitors by their own people. So Netanyahu has no plan. Biden is trying to put the two-state solution back on the international agenda, but that's something that would be hard to do in the short range, again, unless you had committed and brave Palestinian leadership and new leadership in Jerusalem. So frankly, and I hate to end on this gloomy note, what I'm afraid of is if things continue as they are, with Netanyahu permitting unlimited death of civilians in Gaza and permitting settlers to run wild in the West Bank. We are coming up to Ramadan in March. And one of Netanyahu's cabinet ministers wants to allow masses of Jews to pray on the Temple Mount, which is also the location of Al-Aqsa Mosque, third holiest in Islam. At the same time, Israel is forbidding Israeli Arabs to pray there during Ramadan, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. We're building up again to a self-inflicted crisis. If it doesn't happen in Ramadan, I'm afraid the West Bank explosion will come sooner or later and will be based on Jerusalem. Netanyahu simply doesn't have vision, and he is holding on to his radical cabinet because they will prevent him from going to jail on corruption charges. And so right now, I only see things going in the wrong direction. And again, I repeat, I only see a chance for moving towards some kind of political solution for the Palestinians if you have new leadership, both for the Palestinians and in Jerusalem.
Thank you, Trudy. So much to talk about, so many questions that we still have, but we are out of time. I thank you again to you for sharing your expertise with us, and thank all of you for joining us today for Inquirer Live. You can direct friends who missed the event to inquirer.com/live, where a recording will be posted very shortly. And we hope to see you all next time. Thank you so much.